efforts undertaken, by workers at Starbucks to join a union. On August 30th of this year, workers at 3 Starbucks locations petitioned the National Labor Relations Board to hold an election so that the workers could vote on whether or not they wish to be represented by Workers United. So today, there are 3 things we're going to try and learn in this educational seminar. The first is, how can workers join a union? How do they get that union in their workplace? Number 2, what is happening at Starbucks to the workers there as a result of their efforts to unionize? And we're going to hear from 2 Starbucks workers on that. And then what's the larger context in the US? What are the trends? What's happening in labor activism? We're going to hear from 4 panelists. The first is Dick Griffin. Dick has spent a career working as a labor attorney and incidentally was also born and raised in Buffalo, New York. Dick was nominated by President Barack Obama to serve on the National Labor Relations Board, and he was also nominated to serve and did serve as the General Counsel to the National Labor Relations Board. He's now an attorney at Bredhoff and Kaiser in Washington, D.C. We're going to hear from 2 baristas, 2 Starbucks partners, as they're called in Starbucks, Michelle Eisen and Casey Moore. Good morning. These are 2 Starbucks workers who are working in the Buffalo area at 2 different stores. And we're going to hear from Johnnie Kallas. And he's going to tell us, like, how does this fit into the context in America? Like, what's going on? Johnnie is a 4th-year PhD candidate at Cornell's ILR School and a former labor organizer. And Johnnie also is the project director of a really cool tool called the ILR Labor Action Tracker. It's a visual tool that provides real-time data about labor action across the US. So we want this to be interactive between our speakers. If you have any questions, please send them to the Q&A and we'll try and get to them. It's best if you can leave pro-union or anti-union remarks out of your comments and really try and just respectfully use the Q&A for questions. So first, Dick, I want to ask you, with union rates, unionization rates for private sector employees as low as 6.3% this year, many Americans don't know how they actually can form a union in their workplace. Can you please tell us, like, how do you form a union in America?
Thank you, Cathy, for that kind introduction. And if Cricky can put up my PowerPoint, we can walk through the process. So my task here is to describe the representation election process under the National Labor Relations Act. Next slide, please. While workers in the United States were forming unions for many years before the passage of the National Labor Relations Act in 1935, the act marked a watershed moment where the right to form a union was codified into federal law. The law also contained an administrative procedure for holding elections so workers could choose a union to represent them. What was envisioned as a straightforward way to obtain union representation has, largely because of employer resistance to unionization, resulted in workers now having to run a complicated gauntlet. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, the right to organize a union is enshrined in the National Labor Relations Act. You'll see Section 7 on the screen, but achieving its promise of forming a union and engaging in collective bargaining is hard. Next slide, please. 3 factors make it difficult. First, employers almost always have far greater resources than workers in the union. That is certainly the case here, where Starbucks has enormous resources and appears willing to use them to try to defeat the union. Second, employers control access to the workplace, and legally, in most instances, the employer is able to exclude union organizers from the workplace while being itself free to propagandize against the union during work time and in the workplace. And third, the NLRB election process, as you will hear, takes time, particularly if the employer chooses to string it out. Every day that passes gives the employer more time to make use of its greater resources and access to the workers in the workplace to try and persuade workers against the union, or to threaten them about what will happen if they vote yes, or to promise benefits to workers for voting no. These last 2 things are unlawful, but they frequently occur in unionization. campaigns. Next slide, please. With that as background, I will now describe the process. There are two ways to get a union to represent you. The first is called voluntary recognition. That is where the union obtains the support of a majority of the workers and asks the employer to recognize it as the workers' representative. After verifying that the union has the support of the majority, the employer recognizes the union as their representative and sits down to bargain. Lawful route, but it is not the route Starbucks chose, so I will not discuss it further. The second route is the NLRB representation election process, with an election to be conducted by the local regional office of the NLRB. Region 3 of the board is located in Buffalo, and that office is handling the Starbucks election. Next slide, please. The process starts with the filing of a representation petition. Next slide, please. The petition, which you see an example of here, includes information such as the name and address of the employer, what type of company it is, a description of the bargaining unit the union is seeking, including included and excluded job classifications, the number of employees in the unit sought, and the name and address of the petitioning union. Next slide, please. While filing the petition is the beginning of the formal process, the actual organizing campaign usually begins well before the petition is filed. Workers talk to each other, contact the union, and begin seeking support from fellow workers. At some point, most unionization efforts have workers commit to the effort by signing individual authorization cards, where each worker states that the worker wants the union to represent the worker as the worker's exclusive representative for purposes of collective bargaining with the employer over wages, hours, and terms and conditions of employment. At the time the petition is filed or within a short time thereafter, the union must provide evidence that at least 30% of the workers in the petition for group wanted to represent them. This is called the showing of interest. Usually signed authorization cards are used to provide the showing of interest. Sometimes other means, such as petitions signed by the requisite number of workers, are used. Next slide, please. Once the petition is filed, the union and the employer can agree on the terms of the election and present their agreement to the NLRB regional office for approval. That is not what happened in the Starbucks case. Absent agreement, the region will conduct a hearing, and based on the record established in the hearing, the regional director will issue a decision on the contested issues. Next slide, please. Typically, the issues litigated at the hearing involve the scope of the bargaining unit and whether particular individuals or job classifications will be included or excluded for purposes of voting on union representation, and subsequently in the group to be represented if the union prevails. Depending on the nature of these issues, the hearing may go on for multiple days. Here, Starbucks contended that rather than have an election in the individual stores, the unit should include workers from all the 20 Starbucks stores in the area, and litigated this issue for 6 days at a hearing. Next slide, please. The regional director, the NLRB regional director, will ultimately issue a decision based on the record at the hearing, either dismissing the petition or directing an election. If she directs an election, her decision will address all the terms of the election. Here, Acting Regional Director Nancy Wilson directed a mail ballot election to be conducted separately among the employees of each of the 3 stores, and rejected Starbucks' argument for an election among all 20 of the Buffalo area stores. It's worth noting here, as described in the regional director's decision, the separate petitions in the 3 Starbucks stores were filed on August 30th. They were consolidated for hearing that lasted 6 days between September 22nd and September 30th. The regional director issued her decision on September 28th, and the ballots were mailed on November 10th. During this entire time, as you will hear, Starbucks mounted an extensive campaign to persuade the workers not to support the union. There is a right to seek review of the regional director's decision from the board in Washington. Such requests for review are rarely granted, and in fact, Starbucks' request for review was denied by the board earlier this week. Next slide, please. The election is conducted by the NLRB regional staff. Here, for a mail ballot election, the staff put together the ballot packages, mailed them out, and will count them later today. During the count, the employer and the union are entitled to have observers present, and if an observer believes that a voter is not eligible to vote, the observer can challenge the ballot of that voter, and the ballot will be set aside and not opened and counted until subsequent determination if necessary. Next slide, please. If the union gets more votes than the employer does, and any challenged ballots are not determinative of the outcome, the union wins the election. The tie vote goes to the employer. You see on the screen an example of an election where the challenged ballots are not determinative and the union clearly wins the election. 60 eligible voters, 58 ballots cast, 4 challenged ballots, 30 votes for the union, and 24 votes for the employer. The 4 challenged ballots are not determinative, and therefore the union wins. Next slide, please. When the challenged ballots are determinative, the board staff member conducting the election will try to get the union and employer to agree on a resolution. If no resolution is reached, there will be a hearing to determine whether the challenged ballot should be opened and counted, and a new tally of ballots will issue. After the election is over, the employer of the union, whoever loses, can also file with the NLRB regional office objections to the conduct of the election, alleging that some aspect of the election itself was improper. The regional director can resolve those objections administratively or can order a hearing at which evidence on the objections can be presented. If there are also pending challenge ballots, the hearing can address both the challenges and the objections. If there are no, next slide, please. If there are no challenges or objections, or if those are resolved by the regional director in favor of the union, the regional director will certify the union and the employer will have an obligation to bargain. This determination is also subject to review by the board in Washington if the employer seeks review. Many times the process ends here, but if the employer wants the board's action to be reviewed in court, there's a convoluted process for doing so. Next slide, please. That process is called a technical 885. The employer refuses to bargain, the union files an unfair labor practice charge, and then the board's decision on the failure to bargain unfair labor practice is reviewable in the Federal Circuit Courts of Appeals. Next slide, please. If the board unfair labor practice determination is upheld by the circuit court and there's no subsequent Supreme Court review, the employer is finally obligated to bargain with the union. Next slide, please. In conclusion, as you can see from this recitation, if an employer chooses to exercise all its legal rights and to litigate every issue at every step, the official legal path for workers to get a union to represent them can be very long and difficult, and the process of actually obtaining a union contract is even longer. In my view, workers should not have to go through such an extensive process just to exercise a right that has been guaranteed to them by federal law for more than 85 years. I'll turn it back to Cathy now.
Thanks, Dick. So I just want Michelle and Casey, if you guys knew what was up in front of you, would you have gone down this long road? I don't actually want you to answer that question. What I'd like to hear from you two is why did you begin? What was it that was the reason that you all wanted to have a union, and did you know about how to do what Dick just said? So many Americans don't know anything about how to join a union or form a union in their workplace, which is why we're having this educational seminar. And so thank you so much for coming, and then just let us know why you wanted to come together and do this before we get to another section, which we're going to say what happened after you filed the petition.
I think to start, Cathy, first of all, thank you for allowing us this opportunity. But secondly, no, I did not know anything about forming a union at all. I mean, it's been a crash course in the last 90 days, I think, for almost all of us to just even understand this process. To go back to your question as to why we wanted it, I've been with the company for 11 years. And in the last 5 of those years, I've really seen our working conditions decline. And no accountability from Starbucks corporate for any of the things that were happening in our cafes, no help. And I was at a point where I had two options. It was either leave a company I devoted my life to for 11 years and go do something else, or try to fix it from the inside out. And that was the reason that I chose to do it. The opportunity presented itself. I was not at the beginning of this organizing campaign. I came in just a few days shy of us going public, but when I was made aware of it and I was sort of understood what this could do, how this could help me and my fellow partners in this working environment. And I signed on. It took a 15-minute conversation with one of the organizers before I said, absolutely, that's the right option for me.
Right. And yeah, thank you so much for having us. Just to go off what Michelle was saying, I think for me, I had good ideas about what unions could do. My dad is in the teachers union, but I had only ever really associated unions with teachers and nurses and mainly construction workers and the building trades. So when I first started, I was like really like a union for baristas, but then the more I learned about it, the more I thought, why not? There's no reason that baristas shouldn't get the same benefits and quality of life that other workers do. It's just as difficult. And honestly, we're hoping that what we see here is just the start of what could be unions in the service industry and really change what it means to work in the service industry. And to go to your other point is, how did we get involved? How do we even know how to do this? I think, as Michelle said, every single day was us learning about how difficult it is to form a union in this country, and just the odds against us are incredibly insurmountable. But today is our vote count, and we are confident that we'll win the first unionized Starbucks store in the United States despite those odds. So it's incredibly exciting. If we seem like jittery, that's why, because we're on our way to the vote count right after this. But it is every step of the way, the laws have been against us. And despite that, we're still confident we're going to be successful, but it's an incredibly daunting and challenging process. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's so exciting that we're having this today. So appreciate you stepping up this morning before this afternoon's vote count. So neither of you had any real serious knowledge about the idea that service workers could organize into a union. And now, like, maybe you're lighting a fire in America. We'll see. Johnnie Kallas, why don't you tell us about what's happening in America, Johnnie, in your academic perch there at Cornell University. What's going on in America?
Sure, thanks, Cathy. Let me just share my screen and get the PowerPoint up. I assume you can all see that okay?
Yes.
Great, so thanks very much for the invitation to speak on this panel. It's really incredibly inspiring to hear about the organizing work that Michelle, Casey, and their co-workers have done across Starbucks locations in Western New York, especially considering the immense challenges that they and too many workers face in forming a union in this country. So as Cathy mentioned, my name is Johnnie Kallas, and my goal here is to just provide some brief broader context about labor activism in 2021. I'll be drawing on descriptive data from an innovative data set on strikes and labor protests that I'll discuss in a moment, and hopefully stimulate a discussion on the challenges workers and the labor movement face in translating higher levels of labor activism we've seen this year into more sustainable gains over the long term. Oh, okay, I think we're good. So as has already been mentioned and discussed a little bit, workers face, I would say, dual challenges of employer power and inadequate labor law, which have really only intensified since the late 20th century. I am an aspiring academic, as Cathy just mentioned, so I'm just going to briefly discuss some literature on this topic. Research has demonstrated the negative impact of employer opposition, including so-called legal tactics like captive audience meetings and illegal conduct like intimidation and termination of union activists on union organizing success. One study by John Paul Ferguson demonstrates the difficulty of forming a union and winning a first contract. He concludes, based on data from 1999 to 2004, that only 1 out of 7 NLRB organizing drives resulted in a first contract within a year of certification, showing how employer opposition at each level of the campaign significantly hurts a union's chance at winning an election and achieving a first contract. I don't think there's much reason to expect that organizing has become easier since the early to mid 2000s. And then similarly, I have a particular interest in strikes, and I know we have a question in the chat about that. The ability of employers to permanently replace workers on an economic strike plays a big role as well. So these labor laws still have considerable impact today. I list here 4 ongoing strikes across manufacturing, healthcare, and even in higher education, where workers all face the threat of permanent replacements as they're currently on strike to improve their working conditions. That being said, despite these challenges, it does appear that we have witnessed an increase in labor activism since 2020, though existing data sources have several limitations. So the health and safety threats posed by the pandemic and also police shootings of Black people led to increased labor activism in 2020. A good example of this is the wildcat strike by NBA players after the police shooting of Jacob Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin. You may remember from last summer. In 2021, we have witnessed organizing campaigns at major corporations like Amazon and now Starbucks. In addition to increase in strikes since October, due to both large work stoppages like the strike by over 10,000 UAW members at John Deere, and smaller but still very disruptive strikes like sickouts by school bus drivers across the country. However, the big question that remains is whether this represents really a new moment for the US labor movement. So to begin answering this question, I think we first need to better understand the scope and extent of labor activism across the country. As I mentioned before, existing data sources on strikes and labor protests suffer from considerable limitations that really leave activists, policymakers, and scholars misinformed about the true level of labor unrest. For example, since funding cuts by the Reagan administration in the early 1980s, the Bureau of Labor Statistics only documents work stoppages that involve 1,000 or more employees and last at least an entire shift. This would leave out very important strikes like the ongoing strike by over 700 nurses affiliated with the Massachusetts Nurses Association at St. Vincent Hospital in Worcester, Massachusetts, which is owned and operated by a giant for-profit corporation, Tenet Healthcare. This strike began on March 8th, 2021, nearly 9 months ago, but it's not at all captured in the BLS data because it, quote, only, unquote, involves over 700 nurses. So to fill this gap, I'm leading a project with an excellent team of researchers and research assistants to create a more accurate database of strike and labor protest activity across the US displayed on an interactive map. And here you can see a screenshot of what our map looks like. We document different strikes and protests, which you can find on the locations tab on the left. You can also filter according to a number of different variables. For example, if you wanted to examine all the strikes in healthcare and which essential demand of the strike was related to COVID-19 protocols, you can do that. And I can provide the link for this, striketracker.ilr.cornell.edu, if you want to examine further. On our project, we also distinguish between strikes and labor protests based on whether a temporary stoppage of work occurs. This relatively inclusive definition allows us to capture more strikes than the BLS, as is evident in the number of strikes we've captured to date, or I'm sorry, as of the end of November of this year, we documented 243 strikes, while the BLS only documented 13 strikes. And just really quickly, we don't have comprehensive data yet. We hope to have that in February on a number of our different variables, such as industry, size of strikes, demands of workers on strikes, et cetera. But we do have some basic data on strikes per month so far in 2021. You can recognize an increase throughout the year and a somewhat noticeable increase in October and November. We documented 58 strikes in each of those months. And then in terms of approximate number of workers on strike, our data are less complete, but we will have that by February. You can see there was an increase in October, more workers on strike than any other month so far this year. The numbers for November, we're still gathering data on. It's going to be just as much, if not more, in November as well. So I would say that the total number of strikes per month in 2021, as I said, demonstrates we've noticed an uptick since October. Important features of these strikes are that they occur in several different industries and include both union and non-union workers. And I'd say among the more notable actions that we've documented are strikes by union and non-union school bus drivers. So we documented 15 of these strikes, often in the form of sickouts between mid-September and mid-November. While these strikes are relatively small, some only involve 20 or 30 workers, they are incredibly disruptive and all were related to maybe some of the same issues that Michelle and Casey are facing at Starbucks, understaffing, low pay, really harsh working conditions. And many of these strikes really occurred in defiance of union leadership or even in defiance of state legislation banning strikes by public sector workers. I do just want to quickly provide, I don't know if it's a cautionary note, I don't mean to sound pessimistic at all, I just want to contextualize the current uptick in labor activism we're witnessing. This is a chart or a graph of the approximate number of workers on strike involved in large work stoppages since the 1950s. As you can see, the number of workers on strike considerably declined over time. There was a bit of an uptick in 2018 and 19 due to the large red state teacher walkouts you all may be familiar with, before a significant drop in 2020. As I said, this data are incomplete because it only looks at large work stoppages. I'll say for 2021, unless there's a considerably large strike or two in December, it'll probably be higher than the numbers in 2020, but lower than the numbers in 2018 and 19. So just a couple of sort of concluding slides to try and connect with the broader discussion today. What does this mean for labor organizing? Has an increase in labor activism that we've documented led to higher unionization or new forms of collective representation? So we do have some case study evidence of strikes that have led directly to union organizing, though they've remained relatively rare. For example, school bus drivers in Anne Arundel County, Maryland, followed a sick-out strike in October by voting to unionize in November. However, more broadly speaking, data suggests that union campaigns have held steady or even decreased. You can see this table of NLRB petitions from 2012 to 2021. And you can see that really during the pandemic, petition filings sort of held steady or have even declined in 2020 and 2021. The fiscal year does end on September 30th, so it is possible that the uptick in strikes in October and November we've documented could begin to translate into more organizing. However, initial data from October suggests the number of petitions filed do not differ considerably from prior months in 2021. So this really is a major question here. Does this new labor activism, does it translate into union organizing despite many of the challenges and obstacles we know to be present in union organizing campaigns? And just finally, what conclusions can we draw with this understanding? So perhaps we need to focus on and better incorporate organizing and activism outside of traditional union structures. So workers have been organizing and acting like a union even without traditional union rights or in defiance of existing collective bargaining agreements. There was a walkout at Netflix in protest of transphobic comments by Dave Chappelle last month. NBA players also, I mentioned earlier, held a wildcat strike in response to racial justice issues and the police shooting of Jacob Blake. They serve as important examples and reflect an emerging form of activism and new forms of organizing. At the same time, we've also heard about the importance from Michelle and Casey about forming a union and achieving collective bargaining, even in the face of immense challenges. So I think that any effort to help workers overcome these challenges, whether it's through the PRO Act or other support, is really significant to try and help convert this uptick of labor activism into more sustainable organization. And I think we probably want to hear from other people, but feel free to check out our project at striketracker.ilr.cornell.edu. And you can follow us on Twitter as well. And I will turn it back over to Cathy. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much, Johnny. So that is both positive and negative conflicting messages that even with everything that we're hearing, that it really hasn't translated into much new union membership in the country. Dick, do you have something you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just want to, in the interest, as Johnny pointed out, of accurate data and considering what relevant factors are, because of the pandemic, the NLRB regional offices were essentially shut down, and for an extended period of time during the more recent period, we're not holding any elections at all. And so one thing that's hard to know for that particular year or that particular period is the extent to which there was a chilling effect on people filing petitions because they knew no elections would be processed. And per my earlier remarks, if you filed a petition and it just sat there waiting for the board to process it, that would just extend the period of time that the employer campaigned to try and persuade or convince the workers not to support the union, that would just extend the time that could be going on. So I think this year may well be a little bit of anomaly for that reason, although the trend that Johnnie points out is, I agree 100% with.
So Michelle and Casey, there's a question in the chat about a reporter from Vox is on here, and that person is asking, they're interested in what a Starbucks union will mean for other workers in the United States. I mean, any of you can comment. Do you two want to chime first?
I mean, I think we're hoping that it's something that is a transformative action for this industry. This is an industry that has, unfortunately, through most of at least current history, the most recent history, been looked down upon. It's looked upon as unskilled labor, which is fascinating because the level of skill that I've always thought was required to do what we do and what most service industry members do is pretty high level, just to function in that workplace safely and make sure that everyone is served the way that they should be. And I think we are looking for it to lend a little respect to positions that don't generally get that kind of respect. I mean, whether this is a temporary job to get somebody through college, a couple of years, or whether it is something like for me, which allowed me to have health benefits for the last decade of my life, it's a industry that deserves good working conditions and a livable wage, if not an above livable wage. And that is something that we should all demand, no matter if we're spending, a temporary amount of time in that environment or a longer amount of time in that environment. So if the effort to unionize and unions come from this in this industry, I think that's what we should hope to get out of it.
Right. Does anyone else have a comment they want to make on that? I might chime in here myself that I don't like when I hear the term good jobs versus bad jobs. All jobs are good jobs. Some jobs are just paid better than other jobs. Why is working in a coal mine a good job when you know that you're very much in danger of getting black lung and dying at a very young age? That is not a good job. I would rather make lattes. But that pays better and has better benefits. And why is that? Because United Mine Workers strove for several decades. So it's no job is a bad job, and every job has dignity, whether it's cleaning a janitor's job or working in IT. It's my opinion is that they're all good jobs and they should be fairly paid. There's another question. We'll get to some of these other questions. One question is, what changes in the law do you think would make it easier for workers to organize than it is now? Dick, do you want to take that, or Johnnie?
I'm happy to take it. Johnnie mentioned his remarks, a piece of legislation that's pending called the PRO Act, which is an extremely comprehensive revision to the labor laws and includes an enormous number of significant changes. And I won't try and summarize them all here, but one of the things that it does is it makes the penalties for unfair labor practices much more significant. Currently, if the employer violates the law, there's a very limited penalty, and not a penalty. In fact, it can't be a penalty. It has to be just reinstatement or back pay or that sort of thing. Whereas the PRO Act would very much disincentivize employers' anti-union conduct, unlawful anti-union conduct, by, for the first time, putting some serious teeth into the remedies, and also giving the board more extensive ability to seek injunctive relief in the federal courts than it currently has. So I think empowering the agency that enforces the law to really disincentivize people from violating it would make a huge difference. And second point, and I won't go on, is that a lot of people are misclassified as independent contractors in the workforce today. And the PRO Act would very much simplify the test for whether you're an employee or an independent contractor. Under the National Labor Relations Act, if you're an independent contractor, you don't have any rights under the Act. So simplifying that test and making sure more people are covered and have those rights, I think would also be substantial and significant.
Johnny, do you want to add anything to that?
Just wanted a quick comment on the question earlier. I think sometimes strikes and union organizing victories can be very contagious. So we saw this in 2018 with teacher strikes, right? They began in West Virginia. They quickly spread to North Carolina, Arizona, Oklahoma, and other states. I think that's why a lot of us are at the edge of our seats with these results coming in this afternoon, because it could inspire a lot of workers across the country in a low unionized sector to fight for union rights, which would be incredibly exciting.
Right.
Oh, sorry.
Go
Just wanted to add, as a worker who has now lived through a union busting campaign, it's one thing to like hear about it and say like, oh, like they threatened us, they intimidated us, but it's like an entirely different thing to live through that. And when I say that, it's incredibly intimidating and scary. And you have people who control your job telling you that you might lose your benefits. That's terrifying, right? And so, we asked Starbucks at the beginning of our campaign to sign the fair election principles, which included things like equal time. If they host a mandatory paid meeting to give us equal time as the people organizing the union, and Starbucks refused to sign this. So, from our perspective as workers, we need things like employers shouldn't be allowed to close stores down early every single week to pay workers to come to anti-union meetings where they tell them that they could lose all these things and basically threaten them and intimidate them. So from our perspective, everything has to change about this process.
I mean, we are at day 104, I think, since filing our petition. If there were labor laws that actually protected the laborers, as I think the intention would be, that we would have already had our union. We wouldn't be sitting here on December 9th after filing on August 30th, waiting for this vote count. We'd already be hopefully sitting around a bargaining table trying to get a contract.
And we'd have probably almost the entire Buffalo region unionized at this point as well.
Yeah.
So let's just pivot to that then. So Dick has shared with us in a very good primer. Thank you, Dick, for how do you form a union in America? And we see from what he has said that it's no easy task, and that even after today, Starbucks workers will have to continue the battle, but they can't continue alone. They usually need some sort of cultural change in America or community support. But I would love for you to tell us in detail, as much as you can feel comfortable doing, what has happened in the days since you filed that petition on August 30th. And then maybe you can each say what store you're from. One store is having a union vote and one store is not having a union vote. But let's start with what has happened to, I think it's an untold story. What's happened to management at the Starbucks where there have been just the whiff of unionization?
Sure. So within moments, I would say, of those petitions being filed at the end of August, Buffalo was inundated with high-level corporate from Starbucks all across the country. Rosanne Williams, she is the president of Starbucks North America, flew in almost immediately. By September 2nd, which was a Thursday, I believe, they were holding their first round of listening sessions. And then within a week of that, every store in the Buffalo market was sent what they are calling support managers. So these managers were brought in from stores, I'm assuming high-performing stores across the country. I'm not sure what their vetting process was, how they decided which managers to pull from their stores and their homes and send to Buffalo. And they were sent here under the guise of, the reason we are filing a union petition is because the market here in Buffalo is in such bad shape that it necessitated a union. And it is in such bad shape, obviously, because our store managers and district managers in this area are so terrible at their job that that's the reason we are filing these petitions. So these support managers were sent in essentially to not only follow our store managers around and make them feel like they didn't know how to do their job and that they weren't taking care of their store, which I'm at the Elmwood location. We have a manager that came on mid-pandemic. She came from Panera. She's the best manager I've ever had in this company in 11 years. On top of being very good at her job, she happens to be a genuinely good human being who cares about her employees and cares about her store. So to have them tell her that we were doing this because of what a bad job she was doing was awful. I mean, the thing I will carry with me probably for a very, very, very long time after this is all over is having to watch the mistreatment of her by corporates and know that even though it is not because of me, it is indirectly because of a decision that I made. And that is something that has never left me. The other reason these support managers.
Michelle, do you think that's intentional that that she was treated like that?
100%. I think it was twofold. It was to see if they could get her out of the store. So our tact from the very first listening session that we were asked to attend was to let them know that that was not a problem at our store. Yeah, there are probably some managers and stores around here who should have been let go years ago and were probably actually being protected by the company. So there's some hypocrisy there that all of a sudden they're sweeping in to clean house. She's not one of them. So from the very, very, very beginning of all of this, we maintained how much we loved her and how important she was to our store. So I think they liked, torturing her in front of us and we had to just sort of sit on our hands and watch it happen.
And to go off what Michelle was saying, we've had 6 stores file in the Buffalo region for a union election. Out of those 6 stores, Elmwood, Patty is the only manager that remains. They've either gotten rid of them, made their life miserable, fired them. Granted, some of them were not great managers and probably should have been let go from the company a long time ago, but a lot of them were great managers that were really loved by their stores. And in my case particular, the only reason that my store hasn't filed for an election is because me and my fellow partners love our manager and we're terrified that the company will either fire them or make life so miserable as Michelle was explaining and that he'll choose to leave. We also had a manager who was a whistleblower anonymously tell us that he was told by his district manager that if there was a union effort that started at his store, there would be an investigation into him as a manager and he would likely be fired. So this is a systematized approach by Starbucks to punish managers if their store unionizes.
And to scapegoat the managers. I mean, the narrative is that the only reason this is happening here in Buffalo is because we're the only market in the United States of all of the Starbucks that are having these issues, when we know for a fact, because we've heard from hundreds of partners across the country, that these issues that we are having here, they're systemic within the company. They don't have to do with the store level managers or even the district managers. They have to do with how the company has managed their stores in the last 5 years. And so the narrative that they need to put out to the public is that it's an issue that was happening here in Buffalo and they've come in to fix all of those issues. So nobody else in the country needs to worry about trying to form a union.
Can I just interject here a couple of things? So this is a message that if you form a union, as Casey said, your store manager will likely be fired at 5 out of 6 of where they've been filed, where petitions have been filed for a union vote. 5 out of the 6 managers have been fired. So Dick, can we ask you, isn't that firing people because of union activity, isn't that illegal under the federal labor law? Can Starbucks just fire a manager because their employees want to be in a union?
Well, I have to be careful about making a judgment, not knowing all the particular facts. But as a doctrinal matter, supervisors are not employees covered by the Act. And so, for better or for worse, they don't have rights. There is case law that if an employer retaliates against the supervisor as a way to get at the employee's efforts, then that can be a violation of the law. So based on what's been said here, it sounds like that's the tactic that's being engaged. And the other thing to know is that a lot of these things may not be technical violations of the law, but they certainly are against the spirit of people's right to form a union, which has been federally protected theoretically for a very long time, and the right to engage in collective bargaining, which again, the public policy of the United States as stated in the National Labor Relations Act is that collective bargaining should be encouraged. So all of these tactics, whether they're actually skirting the illegality or whether they're on the other side, none of them are congruent with the purposes and policies of the original National Labor Relations Act. And Michelle and Casey have eloquently stated, way better than I can, what it's like to live in this kind of a regime and still try and stand up for better working conditions and a legitimate entitlement to a good job. And so, I mean, it should not be this hard. And I think public sentiment is very much in support now of people unions. The percentage of unionization, that big spread is because there's no effective way, or it's very hard to get from here to there.
We've only just touched upon one thing that Starbucks is doing to y'all. So what in the, you started to talk about closing stores and meetings with employers. Maybe we should talk about that in a little more depth. So what has been happening? So Casey, in your store, you have not even filed for a petition for an election. Are you being subjected to captive audience meetings?
Yes. So as Michelle said, right after those initial 3 stores filed for an election, basically and this was seen by a partner from a PowerPoint presentation of a corporate representative, Starbucks sent in what they termed a SWAT team into Buffalo to try to crush our union efforts. So from that filing in late August, we've had meetings almost every single week, including at all the stores in the Buffalo region, including my store. The worst one that I can think of off the top of my head is a 30-minute PowerPoint presentation they had talking about how terrible unions are and how Workers United is, which is the union that we're organizing with. Workers United is just a business. They just want your money. You're going to have to pay dues. There's these tribunals that they can just subject you to, and all of these draconian rules that you can get fined and put on trial for
without representation.
And this was a 30-minute paid presentation that they made us sit through. So these have been happening throughout the whole thing. And of course, along with the PowerPoint presentation, there's also gaslighting, because of course, when you try to they say the union is the third party, don't trust the organizers. You're like, oh, that's me. I'm one of the organizers as a partner. We don't have union organizers here besides Richard Bensinger, who's the one person that's been helping us. But when you try to give the other side of the story, they tell you, oh, well, we're just giving you the facts. That's your opinion. So I don't know if there's anything to add.
If they make a statement, it's fact. If you rebut that statement, it's your personal opinion. And I will say that it has worked on some people. I mean, these meetings started, they were just splitting our store into maybe in half. And then the meetings had gotten smaller and smaller so that it stopped being sort of, this is the meeting time, come to whatever meeting you can attend that day. It started being, here's a paper invitation that we're sending to you in the mail, and your meeting time is this time. And then you get to the meeting and you realize you were put in this particular meeting because you're with all of the vocally pro-union people, and they've separated you away from all of your softer spoken coworkers who, they don't really know where they stand, and they still think they may be able to get them to vote no.
Why would they do that?
Because that's their only tact. I mean, their hope is that they can get as many no votes as possible so that they can crush this effort. How do they know? Like, how do they know, Michelle and Cathy, who is pro and who's not? That's a very, very good question. So I've been pretty open from the very moment. I put on a pin as soon as possible, operating in the way that if the more public I wasn't, essentially the more protected I was. So that, I couldn't come into work 3 days after this union campaign started and have, get fired for being 3 minutes late or something like that. I had the option to say, are you sure it's because I was 3 minutes late, or are you sure it's not because I've been wearing this pin for the last 3 days? But a lot of my fellow coworkers were scared to wear a pin. We're scared to be open. And so there haven't been many at my store that have. I maybe 3 or 4 that have worn a pin from day one. We are a very pro store, but a lot of them took the tact of they just didn't want to be cornered by a corporate person while they were trying to do their jobs. And if that meant not being openly pro, that was the path they were going to take.
And what Michelle was saying more, they sent in support managers from around the country. These are they're actually spies for the company. So, they've been trying to get to know us, trying to suss out who may be pro. They've looked up personal information about all of us to try to determine, who could have pro-union sentiments versus who is anti, and been trying to use that to divide and conquer. That hasn't worked, but that's been their tactic.
I mean, they'll bring up something like, oh, so I heard you liked this. Well, you couldn't have heard I liked that because I've never talked about that in this store. You could have searched me on social media and maybe seen that I liked that. So, I mean, I really
like we heard you like puppies, just to let you know that we're watching you. Is that the kind of tactic?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, it's never as innocuous or generic as puppies. It's certainly something more specific that allows you to know that,
for example,
they know who you are.
One of our coworkers, this was during the first 2 weeks of Rossann Williams coming to our store, and Rossann came up to one of our partners who does drag on the side, and she specifically asked him about his experience doing that. And there was no way for her to have known that other than looking him up specifically and doing research on his interests, his passions, and all of that. So it's incredibly invasive.
So they're letting you know. Dick, let's go back to legal. I know that that you don't know all the facts, but what is the status of the law with regard to the employer taking employees on their paid time? So paying employees to attend meetings where they say anti-union things.
Well, that's one of the common tactics, and the reason is because they can do it so long as they don't actually threaten or promise benefits. They can express their opinion and do it in a way that, because they're the employer, and because they control your working life, the way you hear the statements that they will allege is merely their statements of opinion. They are in fact received this by the workers as threatening. So captive audience meetings are allowed under the law up until 24 hours before the election.
So surely the union must have an equal opportunity, or Michelle and Casey as organizers must have an equal opportunity to talk to their co-workers on paid time.
Absolutely not.
The law does not allow for that.
The law does not allow for that. And the surveillance of corporate in our stores also does not really allow for that. So, I mean, I have no problem talking about the union. It's never been a secret where I stand, but what I would never do is put one of my coworkers in an uncomfortable position on the floor by trying to talk to them about the union, knowing that we were being surveilled. Not because I'm afraid to talk about the union, but because I wouldn't put someone I care about in a position to feel uncomfortable. So what we've had to do, and I think this is why this is somehow sort of the wave of the future in terms of labor organizing, is utilize technology. So this isn't the 1930s where the only way to talk to someone about the union was to, go knock on their door at dinner time or call their house phone. I mean, from the very beginning, at least at Elmwood, we set up a group text with our entire staff on it. And anytime we were approaching an anti-union meeting, or anytime we heard of something that was attacked that the company may start to take, we were kind of able to inoculate our coworkers before it happened. So we didn't have to do a lot of in the store. I mean, it would have been wonderful to have been given equal time to talk about the union, but we knew very early on, as soon as they refused to even acknowledge the fair election principles, let alone sign them, that was not going to be a reality. So we started campaigning for the union, via text message or, via our social media. And I don't think that's something that they accounted for. They thought just sending these spies in to stop us from talking about this in our workplace was going to be enough to squash it, when we didn't ever really have to have these conversations in our workplace. We were having them, I could have them on my break sitting in the back room just by sending a text message to everybody. And it was a really effective way to get information out to people in a non-confrontational way. I mean, I don't think that any of my coworkers ever felt pressured by the union, because we never had face-to-face conversations. So unlike the corporate person who's standing 2 inches from your face in the middle of a pandemic, saying the words, "We want you to vote no for the union," that's never anything that from the pro-union side that we even had to attempt to do. And they just didn't know how to counter that.
So maybe you're revealing too many tactics here, Michelle.
I think they have gotten those tactics now, because they've figured it out eventually, but it was useful.
So how often are the support managers in the stores?
They scheduled it so there's always a manager there, whether that was your manager or support manager. They started not to trust our managers because I think they realized that we actually have a great relationship, at least in me and Michelle's case, to our managers. But essentially they tried to make it so at all times you couldn't talk about the union on the floor.
Yeah, there's enough support managers. So most stores were sent at least 2. Elmwood, in Elmwood's case, we've had 4. So there's never a shift where there's not a support manager. And when support managers were like on vacation, they'd send in another, like all of a sudden there'd be a support manager from Chicago that you'd never met. And they're like, "Oh yeah, I'm just here for 2 weeks because Dustin's on vacation." Dustin, who's a support manager, who doesn't need to be here anyway, could certainly take a vacation without shipping somebody in from Chicago to cover his shifts. So, I mean, it's almost astonishing. And what's unfortunate is that it's starting to feel so normal after 90 days of dealing with this, that we have to keep reminding ourselves that nothing that's been happening since we filed our petitions is normal. This is not how things should be. And I have to keep reminding my coworkers that this is not how things should be. Like, do not get used to the way that this is, because eventually it's going to have to at least go back to some element of normalcy.
So now we've talked about, well, in addition to the large captive audiences, are there one-on-one meetings that are happening in the stores?
There are, because what was just stated is that those captive audience meetings have to cease 24 hours before the vote. Now, in our case, it's a mail-in ballot. So those captive audience meetings had to cease 24 hours before the ballots were mailed out. But what is not stated in the law is that those large group meetings, it's illegal to hold those 24 hours before the voting period, but it is not in any way. There's nothing in the law that states that 6 corporate people can't pull one individual worker off the floor and sit with them in the back room for an hour. And that's what's been happening in some of these situations. You've got a 1-on-6. The captive audience meetings were at least us, or at least a group of us together against them. Now it's one worker with up to six to 8 corporate people talking at them in a room. That's the fact that that's legal. Captive audience meetings are not legal, but that happens to remain legal all the way up to the vote count. For us, because it was a mail-in ballot, that gave the company an additional month to essentially pull workers off the floor, even after the ballots went out, to have these conversations.
Hey, Dick, is that legal? Assuming they're saying nothing illegal in the meeting.
I'd be foolish to contradict Michelle, who has this down pat, and I don't even need to be on this thing. She's right. I, in fact, had a case, not to tell a war story, but I had a case that involved people who were putting in fiber optic cable lines, and they were out working at multiple locations. And the supervisors used to give them rides to the place, and they'd use that during the as one-on-one. And then when they drove them to the polling place on the day of the election, they drove them separately, each one in the car. And the whole way to the polling place, they talked to them, the captive audience, but they stopped before they got to the polling place. And our view was that's like a cumulative. If you put all that together, that's the functional equivalent of a captive audience meeting, and we did not prevail in that case. So I think that is something that the current board, which is a more sympathetic board, and the current general counsel, which is a more sympathetic to these efforts, is looking at, trying to figure out ways to expand the captive audience doctrine to kind of get at this workaround that employers have come up with. But as I say, I would not contradict Michelle's statement of the law.
So golly, you guys have been undergoing a lot of legal pressure. So the law of the United States of America is letting this happen to you as it currently stands. What other kinds of, you said of high-level managers have been here in Buffalo that we've seen around town?
Sure, yeah. So we've had Rossann Williams, who is the president of Starbucks North America. There are over 8,000 stores in just the United States. There are 8,000 stores in just the United States of Starbucks locations. I'm not sure why she has effectively moved to Buffalo to manage 20 of them.
We hope she stays and spends her money here. Because I heard she earns quite a bit.
Well, I think
Right.
she's spending Starbucks money here, which I guess is effectively the same thing.
Yeah, so we've had Rossann here as well. We've also had casually one day, I was personally at work, just a regular day, and a man comes in and he's with an operations support person who's in our store quite frequently. And he's introducing himself as John. And I'm saying, oh, John, okay, like that was the only information he provided. And I said, like, okay, what do you do for Starbucks? Do you even work for Starbucks? And he was like, oh, I work with lots of different markets, global markets, local markets. And I was like, oh, so you're an executive? To which he responded, no, I'm a partner. I later found out this is John Culver, who's the COO of the company, who was just casually in Buffalo. But along with that, they've done everything. They've taken our stores and flipped them upside down. Every single thing that occurred in our stores before this union vote is different in terms of how standards are enforced, in terms of how dress code is enforced, in terms of the roles of our manager and the duties that they're allowed to do. For example, hiring. Everything is changed. Maintenance requests that used to take months to get fixed now get fixed within the day. So, I've heard of this idea of laboratory conditions and the fact that in a union campaign, you're not allowed to change those. And I'm actually curious myself if what Starbucks has been doing, if that's even legal, because they've changed everything about our stores.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that. So they took away the right of store managers to hire,
Mm-hmm.
for example.
They still don't have it back. Yeah.
What about that, Dick?
Well,
Sorry to keep putting you on the spot, but this is
no,
what we're trying to show here is the state of labor law in America, the sad state of labor law in America that allows this to happen to people who simply want to voice at work. That is, they have the legal right to have a voice at work, and this is at play. What about the fact that they've taken away their manager's right to hire?
well, I'd like to address it in a little bit broader context, because what Casey was saying was really a whole panoply of things that appear to be in reaction to the union campaign, some of which could be characterized as improving working conditions. For example, the responsiveness on maintenance requests. And to the extent that those things are done, that would be probably, depending on the proof and et cetera, that may well be a basis for an objection to the conduct of the election and setting aside the election. But let me make a point that's not a happy point, which is, assume for purposes of discussion, Starbucks does violate the law. And as a result of violating the law, the union maybe doesn't prevail in the election. And the union says, and the Workers United and you folks say, gee, that's not really fair. This wasn't a fair election. We want a fair election. Well, what happens is you file objections, that gets litigated, you're successful. What you get is a second election down the road, which is a bunch more time during which a lot of these tactics maybe get dialed back, or the ones that are more effective are utilized. And so it's in the very, very, very rarest of instances that the result of the process will be an order directing recognition of the union as opposed to another second election. There's a very old Supreme Court case called the Gissel case, where if there are a series of signature violations of the law and you had a majority before the election and you lost it because of those violations, a remedy can be directing recognition and bargaining with the union. But that is these days a very rare instance. What you're likely to get is a second election. And to Michelle and Casey's point, that would just mean prolonging the 90 days of agony for an extended greater period of time.
Johnnie, is there any literature that talks about what happens the longer a campaign goes on, what's more or less likely to happen to the organizing drive?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that delay for the most part favors the employer. You know, we're also seeing this in the Amazon case, right? I believe that they've ordered a new election. However, it's several months after the fact, and who knows how much turnover has happened. And it just really helps the employer's case. The more delay that there is, the harder it is for workers to realize their right to form a union. So, yeah.
To one of the points that was made, I think, earlier by Michelle about the speed of the election process, there are actually legal regimes that get you an election within 10 days. The California Agricultural Labor Relations Act, which was designed to help migrant farm workers, mandates an election 10 days after the petition is filed. And if they can manage to do it in California for migrant workers, I think we could figure out a way to do it under the National Labor Relations Act for people like Michelle and Casey.
Someone has a comment in the chat, which is appropriate, I think, at this point, is that couldn't Starbucks just say this is part of our national plan, that Ross Ann Williams is here and that this is part of our national plan that we had all along to do in Buffalo? What do you say to that?
I would say, if that's true, there's probably some proof that said they were going to roll out a national plan and it just happened to be starting in Buffalo the day we went public with our campaign. I mean, I assume if there's a plan in place, it was in place before August 23rd of this year. So prove it. I mean, if that's the case, then let us see it. Oh, this just merely coincidental that this all happened to coincide at the exact same time, which is actually what they've said. I mean, it was just by happenstance that they were planning to be in this region right at the time that we filed for unionization. And it took quite a few, I'd say 2 or 3 listening sessions before they sort of lifted that veil a little bit. Certainly the one where we sat through that 30-minute PowerPoint presentation solely on the Workers United Constitution was, it was kind of difficult for them to say that they had no stake in this union campaign after, we were subjected to that. But it took much longer. Still to this day, if you ask them right out to their face, any one of them, what they're actually doing in Buffalo, they will not respond they're here because of the union campaign.
Point blank, it's absurd what they're doing and the gaslighting that has been occurring to not only partners, but to what they're trying to say that they're here to do. And that's what we've been saying the whole time is, at least if you're going to be here, be honest about why Ross Ann Williams is in our stores. And she herself has had multiple stories about why she's here. The first time she was asked, I asked her personally, she said, "Oh, I just happened to be on the East Coast and I'm here because Deanna is your new regional manager and we always do this." Then she told folks at Elmwood she was in Buffalo specifically to address carpet concerns in their back room. So it's inconsistent, it's not true, and they are here to bust our union, and everything that they've done up to this point is they've spent millions of dollars, I'm sure.
This market is bleeding money. There's no way that the profits coming out of Buffalo are in any way matching the amount of money the company has poured into this market. I mean, they have closed stores early to hold these meetings. They have closed stores down for surprise renovations and remodels that were not scheduled. I'm sure they paid tens of thousands of dollars to contractors to get them here on the fly to do these remodels.
Can you talk about that a little more specifically? What have they done in the Buffalo market with regard to closing stores for renovation?
Elmwood was closed for a week in October. This is a remodel that had been scheduled for the last 2 years that had been continually getting pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed. And all of a sudden, middle of a union campaign, this is the time for this remodel. So they shut the store down. We had the option to take paid vacation, had we the vacation time, to attempt to pick up shifts at other stores if we couldn't afford to lose the income, or to take unpaid time off. And it was under the guise of this renovation needs to happen now. This is the time, it has to happen right now. It was just to get us out of our stores. But as I had stated before, all it served to do was give us a break from the continual surveillance that we were under. Most of us were more than happy to walk away for a week and not have to deal with what was going on. But in their minds, I think it was to try and to break us apart. The other stores that were closed down, going slightly backwards to the taking the hiring out of the store manager's hands. What they did was they locked, the day that the union filed their petition, they locked the hiring portal. They locked all of the managers out of the hiring portal. So they didn't even have the option to go in and pull applications anymore. And they brought in recruiters, and they closed a store at the Walden and Anderson location down completely. Closed the store, took the partners, most of the partners out of the store, and they made it a market training, closed training center. So essentially these recruiters now hired people, brought them into a closed store, vetted them, we're assuming there was some vetting, trained them, and then shipped them off to the stores that were going to become the stores that they were going to work at. Now we got 6.
When did that start?
They closed Walden Anderson, I believe it was 2.5 weeks into our campaign. So middle of September. That's when
pause there for a moment. Can we have some comment then on the legality of filing for a union petition and then closing the store?
Yeah, it was mentioned before that the election's supposed to be conducted in laboratory conditions. And the time, what's called the critical period, starts with the filing of the petition. And so conduct that takes place between the filing of the petition and the election is fair game for examining under this laboratory condition standard. It's not to say that stuff that happened before, if you were actually in the nascent phases of the organizing campaign, wouldn't possibly be relevant. But generally speaking, you look at the critical period of the time from the campaign. So if they close the store in order to, for example, screen new people to make sure that they were anti-union or that they had indoctrinated them before they came in, just as maybe one thing that they were doing, that would be very problematic and be a good basis for raising a challenge if the election doesn't turn out.
What that will get them if they prevail. So if what Starbucks did was objectionable conduct or an unfair labor practice, then and the union loses the vote, then Michelle and Casey have the pleasure of going through this all again.
Yeah, there's two, not to get into the legal weeds too much, but if this were to be alleged as an unfair labor practice and to be proven as an unfair labor practice, separate and apart from the impact on the election, part of the remedy would actually be to restore the prior So in the past, for example, when I was at the NLRB, there were facilities that were shut down in response to unionization that had to be reopened subsequently and be put back to work. The employer has a right to go completely out of business, but the case law on doing some partial closing, if it's done in response to a retaliation for union activity, the remedy is to restore what in legal terms is called the status quo prior to the violation. So it would be to reconfigure things back the way they were. But that's not a remedy for objectionable conduct in the election. That's a different proceeding, and the remedy for the objectionable conduct, generally speaking, would be a rerun election.
What when the Michelle and Casey, when you So they've taken now the hiring away from the individual stores and put them all at this one location that they shut down that had a petition. Are you getting any of those employees in your stores now?
We have, Elmwood received 6 of them. The company terminology for a new hire is green bean, which I detest, but it's like an unroasted coffee bean. So we refer to them often as the green beans. So we got 6 of them. They're wonderful human beings. All of them are so, I mean, what they've been able to withstand in a lot of ways is worse than what we had to go through, because they not only had to go through the same anti-union talking points that we did, but they had to do it while trying to learn to do their job. And so when they got to our stores, all of them were undertrained. All of them were terrified. They had been given the bare minimum of what it takes to do this job, and they felt completely underprepared. And they really came in kind of thinking that we were all going to hate them, you know, and I think that was intentional. I think that the company hoped that we didn't like them. I think they were undertrained on purpose so that they would come in on our floors and not be able to do their jobs properly. And we were going to get frustrated. And that was going to create an animosity within our workforce that was going to divide us. And I know that's what it was. It was very intentional, but unfortunately, it may be the average age of a lot of these people that they hire and bring in, or the fact that they grew up in, you know, what the current climate is, and they're very self-aware. And but within the first day of 2 of them being on the floor with me, they had seen me. I had the opportunity to speak at India Walton's rally prior to the mayoral election in Buffalo, and a couple of them had actually been at the rally. And they had an opportunity to approach me and want to get more information on the union solely because they were able to see that.
So it may not have worked.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that we can know. Yeah, I don't think that we can know, but I think that the assumption that these workers were sequestered in the store and they had no contact with the outside world was kind of a silly assumption on the part of corporate.
The other thing is that, you know, for the 3 stores that have voted, the company, the way it works is that the company sets the voting list, which is who gets sent ballots, basically by the NLRB. And even though there's a legal cutoff date for who gets to vote and who doesn't, the company has completely ignored that and tried to put these people on our voter list, which, you know, ultimately may be challenged. But the point is that they've tried everything, both legal and, you know, the NLRB is investigating potential illegal conduct to try to stop our election. And now they've gone so far as to try to stuff the ballots as well with these new people that they've brought in. So, you know, that won't necessarily be held up.
Yeah. One more, I mean, we're going to run out of time and I want to try and get to the questions really quickly. Have there been threats or bribes that have gone on in the stores during the union campaign?
The threats have been veiled. I think they're skirting the line of legality. It's a lot of your benefits may go down. You could risk losing all of your benefits if you unionize. And when asked why that would be a risk, they said, well, you just don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what's going to be in a union contract. And I said, well, I know I'm never going to sign a contract where I'm getting less than I'm getting right now. You know, I can attest to the fact that I would never agree to getting less than I'm currently getting. So the threats have been, you know, you might, as far as bribery goes, I think that goes into what Dick was saying in terms of coming in and fixing long existing issues in the hopes that, you know, just giving us ample amount of labor all of a sudden after operating, you know, in the middle of the pandemic with a bare bones schedule. Now we've got so many people on the floor that our shift supervisors don't even know what position to put them in. So it's just kind of trying to keep us happy within the workplace. My favorite story is that on top of these active listening sessions, they're also holding almost like forced socialization things where you are brought into the store. You're paid to come into the store for like a pizza party, where you get to learn about all of the wonderful benefits that the company has to offer you. And the very first one we had, I'm sure I'm going to offend somebody with this, but I'm just going to say it. We had like a table full of Wegmans pizza, and pizza is my favorite food. And the entire week following that party, I was like, we're in Buffalo, New York, with a pizza shop on every corner. and they gave us a table full of Wegmans pizza. I'm sorry, but if the next pizza party does not have a table full of bocce pizza, like I'm walking out. And the following week we had another pizza party and I walked in and it was an entire table full of bocce pizza. So, I mean, they're clearly listening and trying in any small possible way to make us happy to a degree. But that one was blatant and very comical. I mean, you almost feel like you're in an episode of The Office or something when you walk into these situations. You know, like some of these corporate members really present themselves and they're so stereotypical and there's such caricatures of like what an actual human being would be, that if it wasn't something we were dealing with every single day and the pressure of it, you have to almost sit back and laugh at these attempts.
So we're going to get to some questions. Before I start looking at them, Johnny, you had a question.
Yeah, really quickly, you know, my favorite line in my past life as a union organizer is, would you ever vote for a contract in which you would make less or receive less benefits than you have now? And I think it's really important to remind people that in an organizing campaign, because nobody obviously would. I did have a quick question. So we've talked at length about the obstacles that you all have faced, Michelle and Casey. You guys mentioned earlier some digital organizing strategies or just texting with coworkers. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that, because I've always been really, you know, in the teacher strikes a couple of years ago, which I've referenced, these Facebook groups and digital organizing strategies were so important to bring people together across very different locations. But I never really thought of it as a substitute for in-person organizing, just sort of as a way to facilitate it. Would you challenge me on that, or could you just speak to the role of kind of the text messages and other strategies you all have employed?
I mean, I think you're right. At the end of the day, like the reason that Starbucks hasn't been successful in a lot of cases, and we have in keeping that solidarity between us, is the relationships that we already had with our coworkers and the fact that we go through the same things of working together on the floor and know what that actually is. So I agree with you in some sense. I think I would say, you know, we don't want to give away all of our secrets to management who may be out there, but you know, I will say that I think there is a generational difference in what you're seeing now, especially with, you know, like a lot of our coworkers are millennials or Gen Z, like we have high schoolers on our committee. And I think there's a lot of opportunity to be able to use social media and just like our network over the internet and our phone and our social networks to be able to provide information that the company can't keep up with or respond. For example, our Twitter account, for every time they sent a text, it was up on our Twitter account getting blasted out to the point where they I don't think they know how to respond to that. Their law firm, Littler Mendelson, specifically had you know, their lawyers, I just couldn't imagine to them just scratching their heads, kind of wondering how to respond to a viral Twitter account. So
it was very comical
Yeah.
in the hearing that the first 3 stores were brought into to decide the bargaining unit. Our entire social media history was entered into the official court record. Every meme that had been created, I mean, it was, you know, we're seeing stuff come up that you just don't assume is going to be like an official court document. And we're like, oh, that's Roseanne sweeping the floor. That photo that got all those hits is now in the official court document. So I agree with Casey. I think it's a generational thing. And I'm at the like very early part of the millennial generation. And I'm working, you know, we've got 17-year-olds on our committee who are so much further advanced than me in terms of how they utilize social media. I do not think that it negates that personal connection, but we already had that personal connection in these stores. So it was a way to build upon that personal connection and keep people informed when, you know, we couldn't all be together in the same place.
There are a lot of questions in the chat about like, what do you hope? They're kind of tied. Why did you form a union and what do you hope to achieve at the bargaining table? I think we'll have to bring you back though to talk about that aspect of what's happening at the bargaining going on when we see the results of the election. I just want to ask one last question from Matt Glenn from the Buffalo News has asked, what lessons have you learned from this organizing campaign that you'll apply to the next 3 stores you're trying to organize?
I think there's some danger in.
Oh, we're muted.
No, I
Oh, sorry.
I think
Sorry.
there's some danger in, as Casey had said, going into too much strategy because this is only the first 3 stores and there are 20 stores in this market. But I think what we did learn most blatantly is what length the company is willing to go to, what length they're willing to push things. And that's been invaluable because the only way to sort of approach any subsequent future petitions is to sort of know how they're going to approach it. And they've been very blatant about the lengths that they're going to go to. So we've taken note of all of that. And we're going to make sure that every single store that files a petition is well aware of how this is going to play out, or as aware as we can make them, and hope to get out ahead of a lot of that intimidation. You know, the fear and intimidation comes from the unknown. And fortunately for us, the first 3 stores now know how it's going to be handled. So our goal is to just get as much information to each of these petitioning stores as possible so that there's almost kind of a playbook they can follow so that they know at every point in the process what they're going to come up against with the company.
All right, final question. Are you feeling support from the community or are you feeling hate from the community? Or what are you feeling from the community? I should leave it as
Overwhelming support.
Yeah.
We have gotten so much support, not only nationally, internationally, but like most importantly, like from Buffalo. This is a union town. We're so happy and excited to have this community support that we do. We have folks coming in every day to our stores saying good luck and we support you. So it's been incredible. And I think there are a lot of I think there are a lot of Buffalo folks on the panelists as well. So it's great to have all of you here.
Yeah, Buffalo is a unique city. I mean, I've spent my entire life here, save a very short period of time. And, you know, we support each other. We love a cause. Sometimes we jump onto a cause before we're even fully aware of what the cause is that we're jumping onto, but that's what is the enthusiasm. You know, it probably comes from decades and decades of, you know, having to band together to get through whatever season the Bills are going to put us through this year. But we support each other. You know, it's a you know, a fairly large city, but it feels like a small town, and that's always the way it's been. And my particular store in the Elmwood Village is a neighborhood store. It's one of the very few cafe only neighborhood stores that Starbucks has in this area. And these customers have been coming in for years, some of them a decade. You know, I've watched them have their children and their children are going off to school. I mean, we share our lives with each other. And that's something that, you know, no one from the outside can fully understand. So those attempts to come in from corporate into a city like Buffalo and just assume that they're the ones in charge, it was a pretty large misstep on their account.
So I think we're at time. It's 11:30. That was a really beautiful way to end as an homage to Buffalo, New York. I am not from Buffalo. I immigrated here in 1994 intentionally because I love this city. Johnny and Dick, any last words that you want to say?
I certainly couldn't put it any better than Michelle. And so I'll just leave it with her. Really nice words.
I'll leave it there as well. Really looking forward to the vote count. Hopefully it's a great result.
Oh, did we put in the chat where the vote, how to get to the vote? The vote is, excuse me, Cricky, is it in?
Yep, I'll do that right now, and then we'll send it in the follow-up email immediately after this.
Okay, so the vote is public. One great thing about the pandemic is that you can sign on to anything by Zoom. So you can watch the vote count at Zoom, and we're going to put it right in the chat right now. So lots of accolades for all of you. Here it is in the chat. If you want to copy that, join the Zoom, and we'll send it to you in an email afterwards. I just want to thank the panelists. This was great. We did so much in an hour and a half to, I think, educate the public on how hard it is to organize. But yet, despite all those odds, you all are doing a great job. So thank you, friends, for today, and we will see you soon.